This is Rugby Unity. I am David Pembroke, and joining me from Victoria is Ewen McKenzie. And Ewen, has the wind stopped blowing?
It's subsided to some extent. It's dropped. Yeah, it's come back from 110 kilometre gusts to more sort of solid 40 kilometre gusts. So it's a bit breezy at the moment, but
it was fairly dramatic, wasn't it? We were all set to go for our conversation last week, and there were trees falling down and things blowing.
We literally had a little column, a little corridor of cyclone activity. We had about 10 trees come down across fences and across roads, so had to go and do a bit of clearing so that life can go on. So yeah, it was all a bit dramatic, and definitely 11th hour. So yeah,
there we go. All right. Well, listen, Eddie Jones was to be joining us, but I'm not sure where he is. But I'm sure he's busy doing what he is doing, and he did tell us last week that he is trying something a little different in this preparation, because he's bringing both the Japanese 15 and the test team, the national team, together for a preparation. But the Japan A game against Australia A is this coming weekend in Osaka, and then the test match is the weekend after. So he was trying to work out how it was that he was going to be able to prepare both teams, one on a 1 week cycle and the other one on a 2 week cycle, and then how that was all going to come together, suggesting that there was certainly a lot of staff involved up there to keep it all together. But if you were preparing teams like that, Ewen McKenzie, if you were thinking about how you would run through a preparation like that to give both teams their best opportunity to perform, what sorts of things as a elite coach are you thinking about?
I guess it depends on where the camp, the so-called, or the preparation is being held. So obviously accommodation and the use of the venue. If you've got parallel fields and things like that, you can do things in separation, but also then you can combine. I mean, the advantage of having effectively two teams there is that you can prepare the team aspects of the team aspects in a sort of competitive environment without compromising the rest of it. So, and I know how Eddie works, and there's lots of drills and things like that form part of a training session. But in the end, the teamwork, to be able to train against good opposition who don't necessarily know your plays. If you train against the remainder of your squad, then that's advantageous for them. But they know the calls, and they know the plays, so it's also disadvantage. So they know what the intent is. They know what the game plan is. I don't know how Eddie's going to run it, and I don't know if the A team has a different, the Japanese 15 has a different game plan method. So you would assume that they'd be independent in some ways. So therefore you can run that, and you can run opposed scrums, opposed lineouts. Not at 100%, or you can do them at 100% in a week out, but then you can taper that down. But you can just have good quality opposition. If there's any injuries and things like that, you can cover that scenario, and it's good for the Japanese A side, because they can, they feel closer to the action. They feel closer. It gives Eddie a good look at them, which is what you really want. You see a lot when you're a coach, you see what you see in a game, and that's interesting, and that's the culmination of a preparation. But it's seeing what players are like in training is what I used to like to do. I used to go and visit the super teams during the week, because you see how players interact, you see how players, the intensity that players train with, whether they take shortcuts, whatever. You're looking for that, all those little sort of indicators about what the player might be in terms of a squad. And I've always talked about in your squad, you need a good core of blokes who are going to give you that budgeted performance. Going to be, they mightn't be the flashiest player, but they're not going to be the worst player on the day. They're just going to give you a budgeted performance. And you can see that in a training environment. You can see, so that gives you some idea where you might be going with future selections and the like. So it works in all of those aspects. You've got, if you're using a single gym, you've obviously got a scheduled gym training time, so doing weight training and things like that. So there's a bit there to prepare for. But Eddie's the master of, he would have had his calendar prepared 6 months ago for this. He would have all of he's got little codes and things like that, how he creates his calendar for a training week. And there's always some poor secretary that's got to actually type it up and then change it on the 27th review. But it's there, and it'll be down to the half minute. And, that's how he runs things, so that they'll have to fit in with his program. And it's good for those players to have a look at the national program as well. So I don't see any downside. I just see it as an extra administrative organised challenge, but not a negative in terms of the rugby preparation.
How was your approach different to Eddie Jones's approach, given that you were so really close in your development of your thinking about the game, going back to those early days at Randwick when you did play together, but then clearly at the Brumbies you had such a fundamental input into the way that developed, and then you went through to the Wallabies together. But how were you different, and how were you alike?
Well, you tend to mimic bits and pieces as you go along from coaches you've had or coaches you've coached with. So the preparation side of things, planning your season and being working 12 months of the year in a cycle to try and be better the following year. When the season finishes, then the real work starts in terms of preparing for the following year. I see a lot of, and I picked up from Eddie there. There's a lot you can do, whereas I think a lot. Let's take a Super Rugby coach. You can finish the season in June, let's say, and then you can lose 4 months because players go back to. So you haven't got the responsibility of managing those players, sort of hour by hour for the next 4 months, let's say, and then you've got your pre-season starting in October, November, something like that. It varies, obviously, with the program. So you can lose 4 or 5 months there where you can not really achieve a great deal, or you can really try and capitalise on that. And we worked very hard. I learnt that the work ethic in that period of time is to not lose opportunity, and that's where a lot of the planning gets done. And when I talk about the calendar and the detail, when you've got a calendar that you want to put in front of the players, it's got to mean something, and it also needs to have flexibility in it. And Eddie had a very detailed calendar. I was probably a little bit less detailed, had a little bit more flexibility, but in principle the same ideas of trying to make sure that you don't lose time. I didn't. Eddie, worked to the minute and a half in training, and that. There's definitely benefit in that later in the week. From early in the week when you're doing preparation work and you're trying to get tactics and things like that into training, sometimes you had to vary the time, and that's where you could control it as on the field. But Eddie's a bit more sticks to the plan. So I probably had a bit more flexibility in that space. But broadly speaking, the idea of benefiting from 12 months, and we joke about Eddie catching up with people laterally in other sports and things like that, but that's all about trying to inherit and find the 1% differences that will make some sort of difference, or understand why that could make a difference. And I sort of subscribe to that. Probably in the same way, I spend a lot of time with AFL. I thought about it the other day. I would have been to 7 or 8 AFL clubs over my time, and rugby league clubs and the like. So and you form relationships with those people, and that helps you, and it helps you with recruitment. It helps you in other ways, but it does allow you to think about and also observe how other people do it, because you don't know when you're sitting there in some sort of elite program. You don't quite know. You can't go to Clubland and they're operating on 2 or 3 nights a week. It's a very different program than when you're responsible for those players 24/7. So that's that. And then when you go to the national program, it's different because we don't really have access to the players for half the year. So it's all very different. You just got to be able to adjust to that. But in a provincial sense, Eddie will be capitalising on every moment, and he will see this as an opportunity. And I would do it exactly the same as him. If there's an opportunity to drag your academy in, or get the Japanese 15 in, or whatever it is, to try and get that opposed training. I remember once with remember once when we trained in the World Cup, we actually trained against one of the African teams. I can't even remember which team it was. It was like Zambia or something like that. We just trained. It was a big moment for them. We're in France, and it was a big moment for them. But it was good for us because we didn't know them. So when we scrummed and did lineouts and stuff like that, they had no clue. So then they just worked on the cues of the game, and that's how you have to function in a game, in a test match environment, because you're usually playing someone for the first time. You don't tend to play them week after week. So yeah, lots to be learnt, and you got to be flexible in your thinking, but strict in your time management.
But my observation of it, having been in and around, professional teams for 30 odd years, that players do respond well to coaches who are prepared. And when it's well thought through, it's well organised, there is ability for input, and that builds confidence. And you've said this a couple of times in recent weeks, that it was always part of your plan to build confidence through clarity and through certainty about what it was that you were expecting the players to do once they got onto the field.
Yeah, there's two parts to, and I've just been watching the Six Nations show on Netflix. I was watching that last night, and it's interesting to see the different coaching approaches. You only get a snapshot, but there's the emotional piece and there's the technical piece, in every week, and you've got to manage both of those. And sometimes you're more on one and less on the other, and vice versa, depending on where you think the players are at and the nature of the opposition. But I do feel that I've always felt that knowledge is king. So the more that you can get the ownership of the plan or the ideas, and for me it was a week to week. The challenge was to try and get that week to week. A lot of people didn't think you could do that, or just tended to have a broad game and just played the same game every week and didn't worry too much about their opponent. I tended to think the other way and spent time trying to understand the opponent and then look at our approach, and then we'd try and have a game for all seasons, and that would adapt week to week. And I think that made it interesting for the players. And then you just got to get the game callers and the game managers who are on the field to own the various aspects of the plan. And there was some excitement in that. If you could make it interesting, and I recall going to the Stormers in South Africa, and we were a running team at the time, and everyone expected us to run, but the plan was to not run at all. In fact, we kicked the ball back to them every time we got it, and to the point that the crowd wasn't very happy because they were expecting us to be the entertainers. But no, we said, no, you got your own team here. They're in front of you. They can do the entertaining. We'll just give you the ball. So we backed our defence, kicked them the ball, and we kept doing that. And we won the game there in Cape Town. It was a difficult circumstance to win on the road in Super Rugby, but we did it. But we did the opposite.
Was that first Brumbies win in Cape Town?
That was a Reds. It was a Reds win there in 11.
Reds.
But
okay.
But it was just we just gave the opposite, and so the players were interested in that because you don't know if they actually believe it or not. But at least they did it. Quay did it, and it worked. So we just kept kicking the ball, and they were waiting to smash us in defence and make us drop the ball, and they'd play off the counter-attack. In fact, we kicked them the ball and we almost shamed them into running because their crowd was baying for some action and we weren't going to give it to them. So we made them give it, and they dropped the ball and we scored off their mistakes. And it wasn't a high-scoring game, but it was enough, and there was an emotional piece behind that because we'd all been to South Africa a million times and come up with, travelled around there for 2 weeks and come home with no points. There's nothing more defeating than to sort of spend 2 weeks on the road and have no points in the table for it. So we had an emotional back set to that, which the players bought into, a bit of historical stuff, and which I played around with. But the combination of those two things worked, and we got that win, and it put us in a position to be in the finals and go on to win it in the end. If you don't win in South Africa, it's very hard to be in the finals.
Do you remember the reaction in the rooms after the game, the satisfaction that the plan had worked?
Yes, obviously the individuals are like the Quades, and they can see, and that's where the trust comes from, because if they trust you, if it works, then obviously trust comes with that. And there was some jocularity because the the emotional piece that was behind it. There's some ancient Greek history in there. I'm not going to go into the detail, but anyway, there was some jocularity around that piece. But yeah, the players, that's where you get the confidence. So then the next week you're playing, and you're coming off South Africa. You come off a short week. You haven't got much time to prepare, but you've got things in the bank, and that's where you get the benefit of the off-season preparation to make sure you've got the right amount of stuff and you introduce it in the right order, because it's always easy to get your defence sorted at the start of the season and build your attack rather than try and go out there and run all your attack stuff early on and not be good defensively, and you can build your way into a competition like that. So, yes, all of that leads to confidence and you just build from there. So that's how you work sort of hand in glove with the playing group to try and that's how I did it. But you could just run the same game plan if you wanted to, just try and be good at 3 or 4 things, and that works if you've got the best scrum or the best lineup. But if you haven't got all the best elements, then you've got to find compromise and you've got to find other ways.
Obviously, we're in sort of it's quite a nice period, I think. It's a bit of a break from, the mayhem that is about to be unleashed in a couple of weeks' time up in the Northern Hemisphere, where there'll be matches coming left, right and centre, which is going to be certainly something to look forward to. But at the moment, we sort of pause. And I do want to ask you in a moment about your views, having had experience in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, about the relative domestic competitions. But there was very sad news during the week that Lewis Moody, the great England captain, certainly a formidable player, wonderful player of the game, diagnosed with motor neurone disease. And clearly there's, an issue around players, and there's the lawsuit that is making its way through to be resolved around, duty of care around players with whether it be dementia or some of these other degenerative diseases. Interestingly, there's a paper that was published in New Zealand in September that's shown that around some of those neurodegenerative diseases that, a study of the population versus, people who've played rugby, that there wasn't a massive difference in those impacts. But as someone who did play at the highest levels of the game back in the day, particularly, those late 80s, 90s, and you obviously have been around the game for a long time, a number of the players who've been impacted, you would know personally, I'm sure, would have played with, coached against. As you observe this sort of, part of the game that we need to take seriously and understand more, and clearly I think under the leadership of Brett Robinson, the safety of the players is, the number one priority. So just you and your views as someone who has been in and around the game for so long, as we continue to see, there are risks in the game. But yeah, just your thoughts when first of all, just in terms of that reaction to Lewis Moody's news, but also your views about that wider, movement, I suppose, or the wider legal case that is to be resolved over the next, period of time.
Yeah, obviously it's a sad diagnosis, and you don't wish that upon anyone. Unfortunately, I've just turned 60, so when you look around, and Tony Daly, my former propping mate, he's very quick on the text. He advises me when one of our peers, so one of the guys we played against or with or whatever, has passed away, and there's been quite a few in recent times. Not all from motor neurone, but there's been some. If you look at South Africa, and it's a lot of the guys that I know, and that are obviously we're all playing in the amateur era, and there was zero. I mean, you weren't even getting paid, so you were out there, zero control. I think the only The only thing that I can recall was, I think the Japanese rugby union back in the days, I remember playing over there, they mandated you had to play with a scrum cap on. So when you went to Japan back in the 80s and stuff, you had to play with scrum caps on, because there was some, they were worried about, I think they were worried about anything specific, but they were just worried about the potential of that. And that was back then, and it hasn't really been any sort of movement until obviously in the last 5 or 6 years, I think, with I don't know how the head impact assessment stuff, how long that's been in, I can't even recall. But there's been not much in between. But that's the head side of it. There's the rest of the body as well. And I've got, my head's all right. I didn't get knocked out a lot. But obviously every time you banged into scrums, you were doing it from 3 or 4 metres away. There's none of this touch pause or touch set or whatever it is. There's none of that. You were doing it and you were literally running at each other. So there's an impact in there. Well, obviously the brain moves around inside the skull. So I didn't get any. I had 1 or 2 sort of serious head knocks over my career, but I actually did it right. You get banged in the head, but there's a difference between that and getting concussed. So there's that, but there's the rest of the body as well. And there's a lot of the guys that played in the amateur era that aren't protected by any workplace or occupational health and safety or any of those compensation type things. We're all getting double hip replacements, double knee replacements, shoulder replacements, all sorts of spinal. I've had multiple surgeries and things like that. You're paying for that yourself. Look, there's no, you got your own medical. There's no support for that from the amateur era. And there's a lot of the guys that have passed are all from that period where there was no medical advice, but there was no accountability and no responsibility regardless. So there's 2 issues for me. There's that era that is not protected by anything or not compensated by anything. And we've seen a lot of guys pass in recent times from Moody. There's been some in South Africa and Scotland and whatever. So there's that aspect, and there's obviously now they're trying to manage it. You're recognising it's out in the open. It's being recognised. So the implications of all that now, whatever it may be, are at least backed by insurance, compensation, workplace insurance, etc., which all comes via the contractual process at the elite level. But it doesn't help people in clubland so much and whatever. But so it's a downside of the sport, and I guess they're doing everything they can, but it's infiltrated into the laws of the game. We've talked about it over the last 3 or 4 months about the impact of that, the clean-outs and things like that. There's lots of occasions in the game that are what I call incidental. But then I also compare that, I look at all that and I go, that's that. Then you change the channel on the TV and then you're watching, it's not boxing anymore. It's all the cage fighting and things like that. And they're just hooking into each other left, right and centre. And no one mentions anything about head injury assessment or anything like that in that sport. So the whole, and that appeals, the UFC stuff, all appeals to the younger generations largely. And so you get mixed messages about where things are at. You see stupid things on social media where, blokes stand 50 metres apart and runs flat stick and see what happens. And I go, what is the point of that? Like, that's just stupidity. Like, there's no upside to any of that. But they're surrounded by, 100 people all cheering. And I go, so I don't know. The gladiatorial aspect of it never disappears. The gladiatorial aspect of sport and entertainment, it never disappears. It's just a question of where people want to set the bar in terms of who's responsible and accountable for any sort of adverse outcomes. Now, rugby's obviously taking it on literally head on, pardon the pun. It's taking it head on and trying to actually deal with it. But for me, rugby's got there's a dark past, the amateur past, where people have been suffering and they're not in any, so they're not protected in any way, shape or form. So I think that rugby, if they're really right onto it, they should be looking a bit deeper, maybe statistically, into some of that area and see what's going on, because theoretically they're still responsible for that, even though they mightn't be financially accountable for it. It is all part of the same sport. It's all, it'll come through the same system. So there's a lot in that space, and hopefully I like the fact that you say that statistically there isn't a correlation with the motor neuron. That would be pleasing to say there wasn't, but it's no good for the people suffering in the meantime. And we're seeing it. We're seeing it in rugby. We're seeing it in rugby league as well. Rugby league's got some of the older players, but if they're all from the amateur. The quasi and low paid end. So there's no one for them to fall back on, which is disappointing.
Yeah, although also, but in rugby league, the threshold even now, some of the incidents, of head clashes in the final series, it's a lot more.
It's a lot more liberal. I don't quite understand it because I see
in the rugby league.
I see a shoulder charge in one game and they're sending the guy to the bin, and then I see it in another game and no one says boo. So I don't really understand. And then we saw headbutts there in the final, in the grand final. We saw a headbutt that went unattended to as well. So really, it's sort of, I don't know where the threshold is, because once you put all those things in, then suddenly the threshold for getting sent off changes because there's all this stuff in the middle. So yeah, it's not good to see ramifications from what in the end is something that people do because they love the game. That's how I played. In the amateur, we all played because we love the game, and also it is entertainment in the end. It's gladiatorial, but it's entertainment. You don't want to see people suffering for being an entertainer.
So obviously, things like the instrumented mouth guards, that's an innovation, which is, I think, a very, and they're gathering more.
Yeah, that's great.
Using more data. Yeah. And interestingly, in the past week or so, World Rugby has also released the new guidelines for player loads. And so I'll read these out to you and you can give me your reaction. Limit to 30 full games in a season. 6 consecutive game weeks, 5 weeks off a season, rest after the international season, and there will be 12 weeks of mandated non-contact for players in a season. So 30 full games in a season, 6 consecutive game weeks, as a limit, 5 weeks off per season, rest after the international season, and 12 weeks of non-contact. And the other part of it is, increasing the communication between club and country. So people are monitoring and making sure that those information flows are moving. So as one of the leading coaches or former coaches, although people are still asking when you're coming back. But anyway, we'll leave that for another moment.
Yeah, I think 30 full games. I haven't looked at the calendar, but it gets down to what is it half game? You add if you play off, because these front rowers are playing off the bench for 20, getting 20 minutes a game, so they're playing every week. But then I suppose that's offset by the fact that you've got the 5 weeks off, and then by the time you add those things together, it all sort of makes broad sense. I think the rest after the internationals is problematic. If you took the Six Nations, you've got internationals in November, mandated internationals in November. Then you run into the European Cup games and things like that. So I don't know what the window is to be resting internationals and what actually, that's probably why it's the only one that hasn't got a number against it. And there's you'd be rest after the Six Nations as well. And you're running into European Cup competitions. So I don't quite know how that works. And that's probably why there's no number. 12 weeks, no contact. I think there's benefit in that. People focus too much on the game. Whereas, and people say you've got to rest players, and I've mentioned this before, but if I was a player, I'd prefer to be playing the game and not doing the training. Yeah. In other words, be rested from the training. So I think the coach's responsibility is to manage the training weeks so that you can get some of that rest in there. So I worry about the game being the focal point, because often the training can be, if you're replicating the game, which you tend to try and do for a period of time, at least once a week during the week, then that's where you can rest players from that and from scrums and things like that, mauling and whatever. So I think there's opportunity in there. But I can see where they're going with it. I get it. The 34 games is probably, that would be, a lot of the European guys are probably playing more than that. The Southern Hemisphere around that, maybe, if you're in the test program, maybe a bit short. So that's probably around the mark. And then the other six consecutive games is problematic for the same reason, because it's hard enough for the coaches as it is when you don't know what your injury situation is going to be. So to be, resting someone, and New Zealand's been doing this in Super Rugby with the All Blacks. You can rest someone and then suddenly you've got an injury, so then they get dispensation, and then to bring the All Black back early, and so it's all. It works if you can work with the union. If the union, the national union, if you can work hand in glove with them, you can get it. You can get the intent of that program. The idea of the program can come through, but I think there has to be a little bit of flexibility and it has to be signed off on. I don't think you want it to be that set in stone that there's no flexibility in any of that, because for full games, you can calculate. You don't want a situation where the coach is going to go, we're winning the game by 20, so I'll take him off, so that saves me, that'll give me another 30 minutes of him in another game, sort of thing. So I try and building up towards the 30 game limit. So I probably need to see more flesh on the bones from the detail of that, but I understand where they're going, and I think, but I do think more focus on the training week and resting guys from training is the best way to go, because that's where you get the wear and tear. If you could just play on the Saturdays and do nothing during the week, you'd have a long career. But it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, well, there's fairly robust governance around it. They look to have sort of independent advisors, medical advisors, coaches, player representative or ex-player representatives. So anyway, again, I just think as we look to that issue of safety, it's just so important that the game continue to do whatever it can to keep all of its athletes as safe as possible. That has got to be a good thing and a good focus for World Rugby to continue to put some effort around that stuff.
Yeah.
So, interestingly, players are starting to dribble back from the British and Irish Lions tour into the Premiership, into the URC. And I just was interested in getting your views on the different tournaments as they are now working at that provincial layer. The URC, the Prem, Super Rugby, Top 14, League One. I know you've been out of it for a while in sort of any sort of professional way, but clearly you're still an observer, still talking to people. How do you, and you've coached obviously in the Northern Hemisphere as well, how do you sort of assess, the current status of each of those major competitions?
I've been involved in Top 14, so I get that, and that's the pinnacle of a strong
domestic
pyramid domestic promotion and relegation, where teams go up and down. So you got to perform, and so if you don't, you drop off the bottom, and the second last one they're playing playoffs to stay up. So it's the same as in a soccer format, and that works, I think. I mean, it does. They've got rules and regs around foreign players, the percentage of French players, things like that. So that's a pretty solid model, and they haven't really changed the model at all. It's still the same model broadly that I coached in back in 2009. So I think that's a sign of a good competition where you've just got a format that everyone's used to. And they know what's going on in terms of week to week. They just know how it works. And I think I saw some comments the other day by someone talking about the Super Rugby thing, and that's probably where Super Rugby might have failed a little bit, because they kept changing the competition structure. It went from 12 teams to 14 to 15, and then it started. So then you weren't getting everyone playing against each other, and so then there was inequity in terms of the draw and etc. So but then going back to Europe, the URC was, I can't even remember what it was called, but it's got very big because it's become pretty much not the dumping ground, but it's where everyone else that's not in the Prem, they're all playing in that. So it's become a massive number of teams because you've got the South African teams that come in, you've got the Italian teams, the remnants of Wales, you've got Scotland and Ireland. So that one is so big for me, you lose track of where everyone actually is, in terms of the relative. And I'm familiar with the teams. I'm not as familiar with the competition because that's a competition that's changed a lot. It seems to have changed a lot over the years. So, and the Prems, they've obviously tweaked the name, but fundamentally it's been the same. There's been a bit of there's been some carnage with teams going broke, but apart from that, it's been the same, broadly the same. So it seems to be more established and it's got a better funding base or better expectation funding base than whereas the URC's got a massive travel aspect to it, with the South African teams and things like that. So, they're all different. But it seems to me that the competitions that remain stable do better because they're a known product and probably easier to market. They probably self-market to some extent, but that's how it seems to me. Whereas the URC's become a bit of a grab bag for everyone that wasn't in the other two, and so they play in that, and that gives some of them entry into the European Cup, but not obviously the South African teams don't get in. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, that one. Whereas the other ones all have a promotion sort of relegation aspect of the European Cup as well.
How important do you think that promotion relegation is to generate interest?
Again, it works in France because it mirrors the football concept, and the way it is, there's something unique about each French town would have a football team and a rugby team, and so the relative merits of how well they're going will show where they are. In the town, they're all proud towns, and they've got different sizes to them, but they all support their local team. And those teams, you can be in Federal 2 or Federal 1, or you can be somewhere in the structure and then mount a campaign. If you get someone that's got the dollars, will invest in the team and try and get them to climb the ladder. And we've seen this we've seen what's happened with Wrexham in the football. They got the TV guys behind it, a couple of Hollywood guys behind it, and suddenly they've gone a couple of divisions, 2 or 3 divisions, I think, and it's a good story. So that's what can happen without the Hollywood aspect. That can happen in any town in France. They've got the potential to be able to do that if they got the right financial circumstances. So some teams just pitch it where they're at. They don't want to develop it. Some towns or whatever, they don't want to develop the stadium. There's certain capacities you've got to have as a stadium and things like that. So certain criteria to be in the top 14. You've got to be able to, it's got to look good on TV, etc. And you've got to have the facilities for all that. So some towns aren't interested in making that investment. Others are, quite happy to maybe take on that challenge. And so you see that people rise and fall off the bottom of that, and you see some really good teams that are sort of sitting 2 divisions down. And it surprises me because they were like champions like 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So teams like Béziers and some of these teams that are like they're just down. There's something there for everyone if you want to get into it. So and that'll attract people. And then you've got the hardcore Toulouses and Toulons and whatever, and they're always in the top division because the town's just beset by that, and they've got the wealth and whatever to be able to do it, and they can attract the players just by the quality of the program they can offer. And that's where they get a few, but they're limited on the international players. They're going to be very selective. So it is controlled by the French Union to make sure that French eligible players are coming through the system. So I think the French have got a pretty good setup, to be honest. I think that they've got it pretty well sorted.
And you've mentioned a couple of times that it's almost not negotiable that you win at home.
Well, that's more of a Latin thing. That's just a tradition. the way it's structured, you expected to win at home. And I settled that, I think, a month or two back, I settled that. And then I looked at the first round results from the top 14, and half the teams won away from home. So I thought like I was a bit of a fool then, but that would have created a bit of panic. And they have a thing, and I got, a lot of us have been that coached in Europe. You get done in. I got done in by what they call the electroshock, where the team's not performing, and I got punted 5 or 6 games into the second season, even though we're in the semi-finals the year before, in my first season. They have a thing they call the electroshock, where they it's easier to get rid of the coach than it is to get rid of the players if they're not delivering. So they punt the coach, and it's to try and motivate the players to say, well, you're next. So that's all great. But you're the coach. It's easy to get rid of. And funnily enough, I was reading in the paper the other day, and Perpignan, I think it's Perpignan, have been struggling. They're down the bottom of the ladder, and they were there last year, and they haven't gone so well already. So they've already they had a meeting, and they didn't punt the head coach, they punted the 2 assistant coaches, but the same thing. But it's openly called electroshock. In other words, it's telling the team, you better get going, otherwise you're next. So that's already happened in the top 14 already this year, 4 or 5 games in.
Yeah, it's brutal. Well, American sport, college football's, the same. You lose a couple early, see you later. And they in American college football, and they don't mind paying out. The Penn State's just moved on their coach and paid him.
Just saw it.
Did you see that?
49 million.
Yeah, that's right.
They having 49 or 42 million.
49.
And they said, that's only the second. That's only the second highest payout. They paid some other bloke 73 million. This is in college football. I'm going, wow, some big dollars there. But when you go and look at the facilities over there, I went to Texas University and had a look at their football, and it's just amazing. Their football facilities are just incredible.
Yeah, indeed. I was talking to Eddie when he was in the United States recently, and as is his wont to do, he's sort of up and about and visiting everyone and everything, whether it's a basketball team or a football team. And he said even some of the high school football facilities in North America are the equal of our professional rugby setups. The resources that they have for American football are extraordinary. So anyway,
well, they're probably set up as feeders, almost like feeder clubs in a way to feed into the university programs and whatever. So they're probably funded down the line. It would make sense.
Yeah,
fund down certain schools and then try and attract the players to a finite number of schools, so that you got the intensification of the talent, and it makes it easier for them to spot rather than have to go and spot 100 schools. Are only looking at 10, So,
So some questions, and thank you, as always, everybody, for your questions, the Third Voice, for your comments and your very kind comments about the program. We do appreciate each and every one of those comments. We now have viewers, listeners, watchers, over 135 countries now engaged in our conversations here at Rugby Unity. And indeed, on LinkedIn over the weekend, one of our community reached out from Copenhagen just to offer some views. So it's great. And this global nature of our game is its great strength. And there's so much for us to do, I think, to get right. We just have so much potential, and this alignment between the North and the South. What's your view at the moment around, you've got the Prem underway, you've got Top 14 underway, you've got URC underway, but it's largely invisible in the Southern Hemisphere, and we don't talk about it, and we don't see the results in the media, we don't see any of the coverage, we don't see any of the personalities. It's this great weakness, whereas if you look at football, and sure, okay, you can't draw direct comparisons between the two, but there is huge interest in the Southern Hemisphere in Northern Hemisphere football, whereas we do not have a great interest in what is happening in the rugby at this time. A little bit more at the Six Nations, but I'd still argue that it's nowhere where it needs to be. What is your view as someone who has spent time in the North and in the South? how can we join it up more effectively so as that we can realise, this great depth and breadth of the game of rugby?
Unfortunately, I think there's almost like too many rugby games to be able to follow in a given week. It's almost seeming that way. But in terms of the print media, you don't get much unless you go and look and know where to look. So we've discussed that before. I do say from an Australian perspective, Stan TV has the Prem games on there and the South African games. So you can, and to be fair to them, they're condensed too. So you don't have to sit there and watch every minute of every game to be up to speed. You can watch the highlights package and get a feel for the games, which is what I do. I tend to put on a couple of Premiership games and just have a feel to see how the game's trending, but also to see, if it's a close game, see what the results were like, see what they're doing, scrum line and whatever. So it's actually there. And for the cost of a Stan, and I'm not selling Stan here, but I'm just saying for the cost of that, you can visually see that. Now, I guess you could probably search YouTube or something like that and probably find it. But if you're looking for a one-stop shop locally, that's where I would look. But that doesn't give you the top 14 and things like that. So I like the top 14 because I've been involved in it, so I tend to understand it. So I'd love to be able to see that in the same place in terms of highlights and something like that. So it'd be great if there was a central highlights place you can go and select a game and just watch it. I guess we're heading in that direction maybe, but Stan's been around 10 years now. They're still refining their product, but no one else has sort of come into that space to offer a one-stop shop, which is a visual one-stop shop. We can get aggregators on the. We've worked that out already. You can find some aggregators on the print side, but not so much on the visual side. So, that's still ahead of us, which is what we need, I think, to be able to see what's going on. I'm sure they can maybe see the Super Rugby from the north, but there's simply less games when you're looking south. Although we've got the, Super Rugby Americas coming in and whatever, so there's more games getting put into the pot. So. Don't know, but they're all running in parallel. The competitions overlap in the first part of the year. So there's almost too many games to be able to watch. So you've got to be able to, but it would be easier if you could at least find one visual place to go and see highlights. That would be a start.
Yeah, and the shoulder programming, and this is there's a great documentary on Netflix at the moment. It's Jerry Jones. And the Dallas Cowboys, or Cowboys, as he calls them. But he talks about speaking to a television executive years ago from ABC and his observation. This is when Jones was going to be buying the NFL. And the observation was that the appeal of the NFL was that it was a soap opera, 365 days a year. So I think the games are the games, but it's more understanding that shoulder programming of who played well, who didn't play who well. Where are the stars of our game that we're seeing them and thinking about them and talking about them 365 days a year, not just when they either run into our hemisphere or we go and play games over there, we watch that game and then we move on to the next thing. But anyway, I'm not going to solve that problem today.
It's a good point. As I said, I was watching Netflix last night, watching the Six Nations production, and it does focus on certain players, but there are players there I just don't know. At least by watching this show, I'm going to get an insight into the personality, into their preparation. That's giving me thoughts, from a coaching point of view. But if you don't know anyone, it's a good place to start because you see some of the interactions off the field, and you get to know the players. So this tournament I'm watching is obviously was played in the first part of the year, and they were all trying to get into the Lions as a result of it. So, it's interesting to watch it now in retrospect, having seen the Lions series and some of those guys turn up in the Lions team, how that's all sort of came to fruition, or how they actually are as people. So that helps. It's put some background into that Six Nations competition, but it doesn't help us much on the club end, although it doesn't help me much. That's the problem. So, the shoulder programs you're talking about would be great if they invested into the fringes of, into the breadth of the rugby world rather than just I get annoyed at the moment because if you're watching a test match, say here in Australia, they try and get you to watch it at 2 o'clock. It starts at 3 or whatever, and you just get an hour of fairly waffly stuff, and it's, where it'd be better. That would be better if it was more invested in, something proper about the game, but some educational piece rather than just fluff around the ground, which for me, I just try and avoid. All I want to know, and it's really hard to find, what time do they kick off? That's all I want to know, because I only want to watch the game from the kickoff. I don't want to watch the fluff.
Yeah.
So, and it's very hard to find that out because they keep advertising the early bit, but yeah.
But I do think globalisation, technology, the solutions are there, and this is obviously the mission of Rugby Unity, is to try to help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world. And I do believe that alignment between the North and the South will help us to build stronger personalities, bigger brands, which can then attract more attention from more people in more countries. They'll care more about it. Hopefully then bigger television deals, bigger sponsorships involvement, more money in the game, because clearly I think we're well short of the dollars that we need to realise the potential of our game. So anyway, we will keep talking about it. But Ewen McKenzie, I have some questions from the third voice from the audience. And the first one actually was for Eddie Jones from Winston Wiggle, who asks, are you terrified of facing the 2025 Springboks? And I think, given me his answer the other day, I don't think he's looking forward to it at Wembley. And I'm not sure there's going to be a Brighton miracle this year. And another question from Trent3727, Eddie Jones, any interest in coaching the Waratahs? I think I'll answer for him. No. You and McKenzie, you coached the Waratahs. What was that experience
I coached
like?
for 5 years.
Yeah.
Oh, look, I enjoyed the experience. I went there in 2004, and I went there I left Eddie at the Wallabies, and after the World Cup, went to the Waratahs, and I thought, I know what I'm doing here. I've learnt from Eddie, and we've just been in the World Cup final, and so I know boats. I sort of thought, I'll get out there, and so I managed to coach them to, I don't know, the 5th or 6th or something like that. But that's where they were the year before, so I didn't really make any sort of substantial difference. So then I really had a good look at the whole thing and changed some of my approaches and focused on a few other areas. And we got in the final the year after, and we went in the final 3 out of the 5 years. So but always against the Crusaders, and that was always a tough gig. But we got the crowds up from sort of 12,000 up to, we averaged 34,000, I think, one of the seasons. So average crowd. Yeah. So we did a lot around the edges too, in terms of marketing and whatever. And we got people to turn up. One of the problems in Sydney at the time, and it's been that way, is that the clubland wasn't really supporting the state team, and so we tried to sort of build bridges to the clubland and try and get them connected, and we did a lot of things, and it worked in a way because we got the fans to turn up, and it helps when you don't schedule games at the same time as club games. There's some really obvious things you can do. You can give them some tickets and make life easier for them. Yeah. So there's lots of things you can do, simple things, but there are more complicated things that we did over a period of time and got those crowds up. But you had to win too. So we're making finals, the grand final of Super Rugby a number of times, and that 3 times out of those 5 years. So that that helps.
The supporters are there, like the crowds for Super Rugby have been atrocious in Australia for a number of years now. But, you think back to the early days of the Brumbies when you were there and in the years that followed when you moved on, similar sorts of things. So I do think it's possible. I wouldn't be giving up on Super Rugby in any way, shape or form, but there is certainly a job to be done in terms of reactivating that interest, and whether or not it is the run into the 2027 World Cup or the current performances from the Wallabies that's going to help to bring people back. But the winning is part of it, but there's a lot more to it than just winning games. So anyway, another solution from DDTLL. If you get a yellow card, this is the solution. Instead of being sent off, your team loses 3 points. Red card, your team loses 7 points with 5 minutes in the sin bin, and that player has to be subbed off. What do you think of that? In keeping with your idea of trying to keep the teams even.
No, I mean, I think that we've got to think laterally, and I I don't know how you end up with, like, if you don't get the score on your points, you end up with a -3 scoreline or something like that. But you can find problems with everything, but in principle, that's one approach. Yeah, I haven't thought about that side of it. So
I reckon that's not a bad idea. I think that's a great idea.
But you're penalising the team. The team, for me, for an individual's actions. So I probably closer to trying to deal with things off the field and making the individual pay through not being able to be selected or whatever, so they can accrue. I've seen other sports that you accrue points or whatever, but a yellow card costs you something, and if you get multiple yellow cards, then it's going to cost you the ability to be selected.
For match
like
payments
and
all that.
That way the player suffers for their actions.
Yeah.
But also need to delineate between what's cynical and what's inadvertent. And I think we've drifted. There's too many yellow cards for what I think are inadvertent and reactionary things, as opposed to cynical and foul play.
So Jan Koenig,
keep the ideas coming.
Yeah, indeed. This is 4 referees. Here's another idea. There's 4 referees. There's the main referee selected, the 2 assistant referees, and then the TMO has some qualifications in match officiating. Jan Koenig says 4 referees are available. Why don't you rotate them all for 20 minutes? So 20 minutes, and then you go to a sideline, then you go to the TMO, back to the sideline. What do you think about that, Ewen McKenzie?
I think that might be a little bit too complicated. And the TMOs tend to be retired referees or referees that didn't make it, one or the other. So, I don't know. I mean, one of the touch judges is always the nominated replacement referee. So AR2, I think they call him, or AR1. So you could do half-half, I would think. I think 20 minutes is a bit too short, but you could do half-half and see what happens.
Yeah.
Worth a trial, maybe. You could try that, and you get 2 different sort of approaches. But I think, I know at the elite level, you're trying to understand the refereeing from the start of the game, and you assume that that's going to broadly follow suit through the game, and they do tend to referee the same way. So it's better for me to try and adapt to the referee and have him for 80 minutes than try and change that. I just think it's the interaction between the referee and if the referee was able to feel like he can just run the game, I think that works better than having the spectre of other people chatting in his ear all the time. Maybe if they took the headphones off or the microphones off them and just let him referee, that might actually be a better outcome.
Okay, Johan Potgeider says, get rid of the TMO and put 2 refs on the field.
Yeah, I think that's been trialled before. At one point, I think that was trialled.
Certainly trialled. It was used
to manage
Rugby League did it. Rugby League had 2 referees on the field at one point in time.
Yeah, they went away from it again. But in rugby, the biggest thing is space. So if you had one referee controlling, and that's what the touch judges are meant to do, manage the offside line. But they're probably not in a position to do that. If you had someone managing the offside line, at least you're going to have space, a consistent space to be able to play in an attack. But I don't know how they have the overriding call. I've been trying to understand how the AFL does it with four umpires across the field, how they actually don't interfere with each other in terms of the decision making. But yeah, that's again worth a thought, worth consideration.
And a final suggestion from Lindsay Jacobs. Lindsay says, scrum's important and we need to retain it, but if you win the ball, you use it. Don't hold it and play for the penalty. And that advantage should be limited to 3 phases.
I don't know about the advantage. That's a feel thing. So I don't like to have a number on it because I don't think that the advantage in some situations would accrue in 3 phases. You have to build opportunity off a negative circumstance. So I don't necessarily agree. I think that's better left from a feel point of view, although sometimes it does get a bit ridiculous. But on the whole, I think the referees have been managing advantage okay from a penalty perspective. Scrums, yes, no problem with using the ball, but you can't allow the scrums just to collapse in the front row and not do something about it. So you can say, yeah, use the ball, but you still got to adjudicate what's going on, because it's just too easy for a scrum to be put on the ground. As if you're a weaker scrum, you collapse on the ground, that's the end of the scrum.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
you get away with it if you've got a dominant scrum.
So you
get away.
win
You
the
might get away
strike and
with
you
it.
head for the ground.
Yeah, that's right. So that's right. So there's different. You've got to still adjudicate the safety of that, and scrums collapsing is a safety aspect. So if you're going to adjudicate all the other things with around head injuries and things like that, you've got to adjudicate the scrum and not allow it to collapse. So so I think there's a bit of thought there, but I do agree that we've got to keep momentum in the game. It's a really delicate one, the scrum, but the scrum is a meaningful part of the game. They allow second row feeds. If you
Yes.
went back to making them strike for the ball, actually hooking for the ball, you have to keep the scrum at a certain height to be able to do that. Obviously, the defensive scrum will try and take you lower, but you've got to be able to scrum at a height that you can hook for the ball. And it also gives the defensive team an opportunity to get hooked for the ball too, or push the ball. And so there's more incentive. If you're just feeding the second row all the time, there's no incentive on the defensive scrum to do anything. So they can just collapse it. The back row can then drop straight off, and the game goes on. Yeah, but the scrums become irrelevant. Yeah. So I think I'd probably be more inclined to say, no, you've got to put the ball in the middle of this. You've got to feed it in the tunnel.
Yeah.
Like that's what we used to have to do.
Yeah.
And then there's more incentive for both teams to then have to scrum and win the ball. At the moment, the ball's won by the halfback feeding the second row.
And that was always a great part of the game, wasn't it? When there was a strike against the feed, and then all of a sudden, the tension, the game would change again.
Eddie and I, when we played together, that's what we did in club football and whatever. Is we concentrated on doing that, and we won lots of, because you work together with the hooker and you're actually doing something. The defensive hooker is trying to actually do something. So if he's in a position where he can strike for the ball too, he's not pushing. So the pushing contest changes, but you still have to have a certain height in the scrum to be able to hook, or a flexibility in the hooker. So it rewards hookers that are more flexible in the hips and whatever, and rather than just putting a big lump in there, he's just going to push. So we've got to try and get some of the skill elements back in there. I've seen some adjudication now on crooked throws and things like that, because that just went out the window. The ability to throw straight just disappeared out the window when they changed the laws to saying if you don't jump in defence, then you can throw crooked. I think that's really dumb, personally. I think you've got to throw the ball straight. I think that's a mandatory skill. Regardless of whether the opposition jumps or not. There'd be some tolerance, but you can't get away with the stupidity I've seen. I think it's a negative in terms of the skill required to be able to throw the ball. You've got to be able to throw it straight. You've got to get the range right, but you've got to at least throw it straight. Don't think that's too much to ask.
All right, people. Well, Third Voice, thank you so much for those suggestions, and please keep the comments coming. It does help us. It does help us to access the expertise of Ewen McKenzie and Eddie Jones about some of these ideas, and I'm sure lots of people around the world in influential positions are listening, and so we've got to keep working at it. We just have to continue to try to think about how do we look to help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world. And if you listen to Eddie Jones, it's all about what happens on the field. I'm not as convinced. I think that's a big part of it, but there's lots that we need to do off the field as well to improve the commercialisation and the community around our sport. I was going to ask Eddie Jones, he certainly made the headlines in Australia backing R360. I was going to ask him if he was here about, actually I wasn't going to spend too much time on it because I'm starting to get a bit bored with the whole thing because
maybe that's why he's not here. He doesn't want to talk about it.
Maybe he doesn't.
Cone of silence.
Maybe he
Cone
doesn't.
of silence.
I don't know. Like I just want them to sort of come out and tell us what in fact it is and who's going to pay for it. You know, like I think it's. I had a couple of mates over the weekend say to me, "If you mention it one more time, I'm going to turn this show off." And I said, "All right, well, anyway, we'll get to that." But listen, what we are doing, which is very productive, is I'm actually going to Japan on Thursday night. I'm flying up to Tokyo, and I'm going to be there spending a week and a bit exploring Japanese rugby and meeting with a number of the key power brokers. I'm speaking to the chairman of Japanese rugby, and the Japanese have confirmed that they will be bidding for the 2035 World Cup again. And did you get to the 2019 World Cup in Japan, Ewan?
No.
Oh my God, it was great fun. It was so good. It was a tremendous occasion. I had a ball up there. Went up there as a fan with a couple of mates, and we had a fine old time. But speaking to him, speaking to the Japanese head women's coach, Koji Tokamatsu, Glenn Delaney, obviously Eddie Jones, hoping to talk to Werner Dern. So we're going to have a week's worth of programming. We're going to have our normal Rugby Unity programs on Friday and on Monday. So we'll be talking about all of the things in the world of rugby, but there'll be a special series. So not only on the podcast as such, but also a lot of social media content as well. And really interested. Have you had much to do with Japanese rugby, Ewan? Have you ever been sort of appointed to or an advisor to one of the clubs up there?
No, none of that level. I went there as a schoolboy player, and when I was still at school.
Yeah.
And stayed in a rugby hotel back then. I'm talking back in the early 80s, stayed in a dedicated rugby hotel. It was really interesting, culturally. But no, I've been there a number of times with Brumbies and other teams there. It's a great place to visit and tour and whatever. It's just a different world up there, and I'd love to go back. But I was courted to go there and coach, sort of. But I was never that interested in coaching up there per se. I went to Europe instead, and so it hasn't attracted me in that sense, but I'll leave the junkets up to you, mate. You can beat the junket king. But I want to see. I want you. I'm glad you're going to interview Werner Dern. I'm looking forward to that interview. That'll be great.
Yeah, great chat. Also going to catch up with Will Genya, one of your former Chargers. Will's up there now.
Let's see what haircut he's Let's see what haircut he's sporting these days.
He's
always full of surprises.
He's moved from the playing side of it. He's now coaching the Kinetsu Liners, and there's a trial match on the first Saturday up there between Toshiba and Kinetsu Liners, and so I'm going to go to that, and I'm not going to go to the Osaka. The Japan 15 versus Australia A. I'm just going to stay in Tokyo, I think, at this stage. Could change my mind. I could change my mind, but because apparently it's on a bullet train, it's only a couple of hours away down the track. So
it's not far.
But really looking forward to just having a great conversation with people up there. And again, this mission of ours to help secure the future prosperity of rugby union around the world. Japan is such a key market. It's the third largest market in rugby around the world. And so having conversations, and it's interesting you mentioned touring there as a schoolboy, talking with Koji Tokamatsu, who's former president of Asian Rugby, and also one of the big movers up there. He was hosting his club, the Shibuya International Rugby Club, was hosting teams from New Zealand who were touring over there, from Australia who were touring over there. And I think to your point that you've mentioned a few times about how do we help secure the future prosperity of rugby union on the road? Well, we get on the road, we go and have these cultural experiences. So you can imagine as a young sort of under 17 team, under 15 team or something like that, being able to go to Japan and have that experience as you did as a young man. Those memories would stay with you forever.
Yeah, 1981, I went there and to America, so it was that was a great tour. I was 15, I think it was. So went there and went to America. So it was a great start. That's was the hook that kept me going in what was an amateur sport in a very sort of forgotten part of the country, rugby forgotten part of the country in Australia. So that was the hook that got me going and kept me going all the way through.
Yeah, I think
still
that's
here, 45 years later.
Yeah, but I do think that this is when you think about securing the future prosperity of rugby union around the world, that's a layer of what has to happen. But then how do we make that stronger? How do we get more opportunities for people to tour? So anyway, thanks, mate, for joining us. I'm sure Eddie Jones will find us soon enough, and I'm looking forward to catching up with him also in Tokyo over a number of occasions. There's public announcements, there's fan sessions. So yeah, I think the build-up, he told me the other day they've sold over 45,000 tickets to the match already.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, so hopefully they'll get up between 55, 60,000, and he said that the atmosphere at the Tokyo National Stadium will be electric. And obviously there's the element of, Eddie Jones, versus Australia after what happened in 2023. So that'll all add to the soap opera of this particular match. So, yeah, all good. So, anyway, Ewen McKenzie, a big thanks to you and to you, the audience, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for your ongoing engagement with Rugby Unity, whether it is with the podcast, social media, Substack, however it is that you're engaging with us. Please stay involved. Keep your questions coming. Keep your suggestions coming. Recommend us to your friends. Like, subscribe, whatever it is, it will help us to be found, and we certainly do appreciate it. But for the moment, please, people, be kind to each other. My name is David Pembroke, and it's bye for now.